Hi everyone, and welcome to both our panelists and those watching through YouTube. Tonight's panel discussion is under the title Understanding Hateful Extremism. It's the second in our series this year looking into extremism from a spatial perspective and of course in a specific UK context. Today we're going to be discussing the concept of hateful extremism, which was first presented in the 2019 independent report of the Commission on Extremism. We're fortunate today to have several experts with us to discuss the topic in the work that each expert's involved with. We have Dr. Craig McCann from the Centre of Analysis of the Radical Right, Mike Ainsworth, the chair of the Independent Advisory Group on Hate Crime to the National Police Chiefs Council, and Aaliyah Hussain, director and founder of WeRise UK. And of course, myself, a research fellow and project coordinator here at the Dialogue Society, and I'll be chairing virtually our event tonight. I just wanted to begin by defining hateful extremism as it is in kind of quotation marks, and then hopefully we can begin the discussion. So the term hateful extremism has been defined as behaviours that can incite and amplify hate or engage in persistent hatred or equivocate about and make the moral case for violence, and that draw on hateful, hostile or supremacist beliefs directed at an outgroup who are perceived as a threat to the well-being, survival or success of an in-group, and that cause or likely to cause harm to individuals, communities, or the wider society. So it's quite a wide definition, and it would be interesting to kind of see how we can understand this. Hopefully we'll be kind of elaborating on the term, or what it constitutes, and how it can aid perhaps in challenging what hateful extremism is, and if it's perhaps at all necessary to have such a definition, and what benefits or disadvantages it brings. So without holding us for any longer, I'll pass the mic on to our first speaker of the evening, Dr. McCann. Thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me along. I suppose in my my brief input, I'm going to talk through I suppose the historical origins of extremism, or the extremism policy in this country, obviously the Extremism Commission, and then kind of bring you up to date with, I suppose, some of my considerations from a practitioner's perspective as to the utility of hateful extremism as a term. Now, I, by background, I'm a former counter-terrorism police officer. I worked specifically within the swim lane of Prevent for many years. And now I work very much in the international development space. Again, focusing on interagency operability, preventing people from being drawn into terrorism. So really for the last 12 years, I've been working in this space and seen an evolution of some policy directions that I'm not necessarily buying into, and I've been very vocal on some of the dangers therein. So I think I wrote an article on this back in December 2019, and it was in response to the Extremism Commission's report, or their review of the extremism strategy as was. Now, the title of, I just give, I suppose, you an indication of my thinking on this. The title of that article was "The Hateful Extremism Report, Yet More Muddled Thinking in an Already Overcrowded Pitch." So I think it's worth saying that the Extremism Commission were given the very unenviable task of having to define extremism. Now, the government had for many years failed to do this, and it's an exceptionally difficult area of policy provision. Now, I thought at the time when the Extremism Commission published their review, and this was in about October 2019, as I say, they came up with the term hateful extremism by virtue of their research in this area. So what I thought one of the major weaknesses of that research was, and they're very specific, very, very clear in their report on this, it was very blinkered from the very word go. Now, they would, even within the report, it says the Commission has no remit on counter-terrorism policies, including prevent or integration issues. We are mindful of the overlap between terrorism, extremism, and cohesion. So, in many ways, this has kind of perpetuated the mistakes of the past, this thinking, in that it's very siloed. If you're going to review our response to extremism, you have to look at our response to terrorism. You have to look at our response to integration and how these policies interact, where the gaps are, where the overlaps are. If you're looking at one in isolation, you will miss a huge amount of content. And I think that is what's happened within the extremism policy development space. Now, it was interesting as a report because it's very much depended, or the new definition of hateful extremism depended upon data sets that sit within hate crime and within channel, as in our channel program that sits within prevent. So I think in making the case for a renewed approach or a new bold approach to hateful extremism, I'm of the view it doesn't make sense to base that upon data sets that sit in other policy areas. If you're trying to carve out a fiefdom, a new way of thinking, you're really overlapping within two areas of work and being very explicit about that as well, and saying the justification for a new definition of hateful extremism is based upon how we manage vulnerable people in the counter-terrorism space, albeit the preventative space, and hate crime data. So that's the first, I think, or I suppose the first weakness is the fact it's very siloed and very blinkered in its approach. The second weakness is in making this approach contingent upon existing policy areas. And I suppose my argument is, if there's a case for working on the reform of legislation, the reform of policy, why not review what we've already got rather than creating something new and badging it as hateful extremism? I suppose if there are deficits in our counter-terrorism response or our hate crime response to things like public order legislation, why not make them better? Why not actually enhance them and fill the gaps rather than creating a new, as I say, a new policy area, a new fiefdom? And I suppose in many ways, we risk this becoming an entirely theoretical exercise. And when we're thinking about, the ties hitting the tarmac of policy provision, where it goes out to communities and how statutory services like the police, health, education partners, local authorities, how they implement this stuff, that surely matters. And we saw as our first foray into the delivery of counter-extremism, we saw the development of community coordinators in about 14, 15. And these were brand new posts, and they were landed into areas where it was deemed to be of the highest risk. And what they found very quickly is that you have then a community coordinator that's funded by the extremism strategy, a prevent coordinator, and then community integration workers within the local authority. And they're all fighting over the same piece of land. So the community coordinators didn't actually succeed in carving out an operational niche for themselves, because every time they went out to the community to try to do some work, they found that they were, butting heads with people already doing that work. So it's that role was discontinued, and I think it's a really interesting, very tangible way of seeing how this stuff lands when it comes to the actual practice, when it comes to the coalface and people are actually delivering this work, how it butts up against other policy areas, and why we need to get this right. And adopting a siloed approach to this will not work. So I think one of the things I've suggested before is it'd be a really interesting exercise for anyone in this space trying to get a better understanding of this, to first read the Integrated Communities Action Plan. That's the first thing. Read that. That should be the building block of everything we do. In fact, I remember the first iteration of Prevent in 2006-07, and it said, effectively, paraphrasing, none of this stuff works unless we base it on a foundation of integrated communities. And that's absolutely right. That's the thing we need to invest more in. So first read that plan, next read the hate crime action plan, which is a step on from that, and then followed by the prevent strategy. Obviously, that sits within our contest strategy, overall counterterrorism strategy for the UK. And then read the extremism strategy and the accompanying challenging hateful extremism report. And if you build it up in that way, within the context of all of our policies for hate crime, integration, prevention of terrorism, do we need a hateful extremism policy? And that's the fundamental question. What value does it add? And I think a lot of this has its origins in what I refer to as the Great Divorce of 2011. So prevent was seen to have encroached upon the community integration space, and there's certainly a lot of evidence for that, because practitioners are trying to find a niche, as I say, when they go out to do this work in communities. And it's seen there was a real conflation between prevent and community cohesion, and there was this securitization of engagement, particularly with Muslim communities. So that was one of the big central criticisms of prevent. It led to the review in 2011. As I say, the Great Divorce happened, and they tried to delineate between community integration, cohesion work, and preventing terrorism. All abundantly sensible. The problem is, prevent sat very much within the Home Office, and the ball of community integration and cohesion was kicked to the Department for Communities and Local Government, and they then wrote really a policy statement as opposed to a strategy, and it was called Creating the Conditions for Integration. Now, the problem is that didn't really get operationalized, and it led to this, I suppose, this tension between the Home Office trying to do the work around counterterrorism and DCLG, who were notionally the ones who were meant to be combating extremism. So all of those groups, and we're talking a lot about group activity, that falls beneath the threshold for counterterrorism operations. So what are we doing around there? Now, that trundled on for many years, and it got to about 2014-15, and then the Home Office decided to create the counter-extremism strategy. That's really what it was born of. It was this operational need to be seen to be responding to these groups. And we're talking particularly around group activity. The problem is, when you read that initial counter-extremism strategy, a lot of the stuff in it is actually basic integration stuff. Why does this matter? Well, when I was doing my PhD and I was looking at state responses to right-wing extremism in the UK, came across a scenario where a local authority had secured funding for, it was particularly focused on ethnic minority women, for English language classes. So they did a survey, and it was a bit of a you asked for, we delivered type scenario. So you want English language classes, we'll get some funding for this, and then we'll deliver them. Really good buy-in. The courses were just about to start, and then at about the same time, David Cameron made a speech, and it was seen very much at the time as conflating the lack of ability to speak English with vulnerability to becoming a terrorist. And it was really this perceptual link between the two was made. And of course, what then happened? All of these women then contact the local authority and say, you only want to teach us English because you think we might be terrorists. So it shows you really tangibly how, if you encroach upon your engagement with communities through the lens of extremism, they're not going to be interested. It's such a fiercely contested space that you actually just turn people off. Whereas actually, if we were to regain and repivot a lot of the work that we need to do and actually focus it through a lens of integration and cohesion, where we really, I refer to it again in my book as the poor cousin across this policy landscape. It's been underfunded, underutilized for many years. You'd actually find that if you desecuritize the terms of the engagement with our communities, you're far more likely to get buy-in. This is the mistake that we risk perpetuating. We risk almost not learning the mistakes from the first iteration of prevent, now that landed, and now this has been applied to many, many different communities. So I'm not necessarily dismissive of the work of the Commission. By all means, I think they've had a very onerous task over the last few years, and I think it's been exceptionally difficult for them to come up with, their exam question was essentially come up with a definition of extremism. I think they've come up with a definition. It's a working definition, not a legal one, but I think it unnecessarily and potentially dangerously conflates existing policy areas in our response. I think there's some really good stuff in the Commission's most recent report. So it's operating with impunity, hateful extremism in Feb 2021. They rightfully point to some laws that we have that don't go far enough, in my view. So things like public order legislation, counterterrorism legislation, glorification offences, dissemination of terrorist publications. They make the point, quite rightly, that a lot of these offences are contingent upon it needs to be proved that there is a commissioning, preparing, or instigation of acts of terrorism. And this is open to debate, should we be coming back from that to say there's a lot of group activity that doesn't necessarily tip into the counterterrorism threshold, but we still need to have a state response to it? The issue I have is if we have, we've quite rightly identified gaps in our counterterrorism legislation, hate crime legislation, why don't we manage those gaps there in our existing policy areas? Why do we need to have a vehicle of counter-extremism through which to amend and review laws? Why do we need this new way of thinking? Why can't we identify gaps and then address those gaps within these existing bodies of work? So I think it's very interesting, just as a final thought, really, as to how these things have moved on. Because in the October 2019 report, it says, and I'll quote from the report, it says, "We've not yet heard a strong case for more powers to directly counter extremism, but we have heard and we believe that existing powers need to be applied better and more consistently." Now, I would wholeheartedly agree with that conclusion. However, in the 2021, so Feb 2021, the new reports operating with impunity, there are a couple of points are made. It says, in the absence of a legal hateful extremism framework, an operational infrastructure to counter hateful extremism is severely lacking. Then goes on to say, hateful extremism is a distinct activity in its own right, outside of terrorism and hate crime, and requires its own legislation to capture and prevent it. Now, that's a pretty big sea change of view in terms of conclusions from October 19 through to Feb 2021. Initially, let's focus on strengthening the laws we have where they are. And in 2021, we need a new legal framework under the auspices of hateful extremism to address all of these operational gaps. And I suppose my challenge is, why do we need that? So I'll leave it there, if that's okay. Just a few thoughts on, I suppose, the history of where we got to where we are, and I suppose where what the implications are potentially of continuing to frame our engagements with communities through the lens of extremism, when we can't really even define what extremism is, what the band or the scope of this new term are. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I just seen that I've had a couple of questions come through as you were talking, but hopefully we can get to those at the end in the Q&A section. But thank you very much for kind of bringing the historical origins together and kind of exploring how we came to the current definition and whether it is at all needed, and amongst several other things. So thank you very much for your contributions. I'm now going to pass the microphone on to Mike. I was going to say the mic to Mike. We're looking forward to hearing what you've got to share with us. You are muted though.
There's a really strong start. Thank you for that. And I will not claim to have anything like the expertise that Craig has, although I did find myself nodding throughout that. I would like to say that actually from the start, I think actually I agree that we could actually put things right in terms of the hate crime world, but actually I think things have actually gone into reverse in that world because of the conflation between those two in recent years, and I'll try and explain my argument around that. I work in an organisation called Stop Hate UK, which runs a 24-hour helpline for victims of hate crime. I also chair the advisory group for the National Police Chiefs Council on hate crime. And I just wanted to, and of course my screen has managed to stop working as soon as I start to try and share it. Let's hope that that's working from there. There is undoubtedly a link between hate crime and extremism. We've known that since the 1940s, since the report from Allport and the Scale of Prejudice, that at the bottom, as you look towards people moving to areas of extremism, terrorism, and indeed the commission of genocide, we start off in the foothills with the incidents of hate speech, move up into hate incidents and hate crimes, and eventually we can have those horrendous acts of terrorism and indeed acts of genocide. But actually in this country, from the genesis of what happened after the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence, we established a system of working which frankly was world beating. If we compare data from the Crime Survey of England and Wales towards police data, we know that from the death of Stephen Lawrence up until 2015, there was a significant and sizable reduction in the number of hate crimes that are actually being committed. These are not hate crimes reported to the police. These are hate crimes being picked up by the Crime Survey of England and Wales. To the point that when we get to 2015, that reduction is in the order of 250,000 fewer offences, and these are criminal acts, being committed where the motivation of the perpetrator was hatred. We also know that in terms of community confidence, the successes were significant. Following the death of Stephen Lawrence, we know that roughly 1 in 6 hate crimes reported to the police. Go forward to 2015, and that figure goes to 1 in 2. By any measure, the systems and the methodology that was laid down by Macpherson following the death of Stephen Lawrence worked and was effective. Sadly, since 2015, the recognition of that, I think, has been significantly diluted. And I think government policy has actually meant that we're moving now in the opposite direction. Last year, indeed, we saw a 20% increase in the number of hate crimes actually being committed. What are those key recommendations? What are the bits of the building blocks? One is to say that the criminal justice system regards hate as a significant event, and we are going to increase the sentence for perpetrators. It recognizes that the impact of hatred on victims is more significant when the motivation of the perpetrator is hatred towards those victims. It recognizes the need for enhanced support for victims and a human rights approach. One of the things that's fairly unique about the way the legislation is framed in this country is we don't protect specific religions or specific faiths or specific sexual orientations. We protect everybody's right to be who they are. And alongside that, and I think key to some of the success up to 2015, is we recognize that we should not have a hierarchy of hatred, that certain forms of hatred should not be treated as more serious or worthy of more attention than others. And the victim perception, really controversial, but it absolutely comes from the Stephen Lawrence report that says if a victim perceives that a crime is a hate crime, that is how initially it must be investigated and dealt with by the police and the Crime Prosecution Service. We also controversially recognised that hate incidents, those things that fall below the criminal justice threshold, those things that upset community cohesion, but perhaps don't cross the criminal justice threshold, are worthy of attention by both the police and public bodies. And finally, that the police should have, that victims of hate crimes should have somewhere to report hate crimes to 24 hours a day. And that's the origins of my organisation, Stop Hate UK. That is where we come from. And we trace our roots absolutely back to that. And the net result of that is we have something quite remarkable in this country. In the same year that UK police forces investigated 124,000 hate crimes across the United Kingdom, in America, the similar equivalent was 8,000. There are more hate crimes against metropolitan police officers that are investigated in the whole of California. We have developed a method of understanding community cohesion, which frankly is world beating. In March of this year in Kyoto, the United Nations passed a resolution seeking to move the rest of the world onto legislation similar to that that's in existence in the United Kingdom. Sadly, at the same time, the Home Offices and other elements of government have been seeking to move away from those building blocks that Macpherson put down. Why is that? Well, the first bit was the reason why all of this changed in 2015. It was the Brexit referendum. Not the reality of us moving from out of Europe, but the way that the referendum was conducted appeared to give license to individuals that actually hatred again was back on the agenda, and there was allowances for that. We also have had other triggers: Black Lives Matter movement, Gaza, terrorist threats, the London Bridge attack, and indeed statements by Donald Trump. But none of them match the impact that the Brexit referendum had. We also have now a government strategy that is absolutely seeking to move away from these building blocks that laid down. We know, because of the work that the National Community Tension Team are doing and the National Police Chiefs Council are doing, that we can match individual events by the impact that it has on criminal activity and events on hate crime. And those matches are getting more and more scientific. We know, for example, that one of the biggest increases in race hate crime seen in this country, and this is what this graph is showing, was when there was the county demonstrations, the so-called Protect the Statues marches during that weekend. We are able to understand far better, using the work around hate crime, what is driving hatred in this country. And what's the problem? Well, I think part of the problem is it is really uncomfortable for people to know, particularly politicians, that their actions and their statements have a direct impact. We know that this statement from Boris Johnson, for example, had a direct impact. We know that there were dozens of young girls who had articles of clothing removed from them, and Boris Johnson was cited during those acts, and that had a direct impact on the community. And because of that, I think there is a drawing back and there is a reluctance to understand what we have known and what we have talked about. But I do believe there is a significant way forward, and actually a return to those principles that were laid down in the Macpherson report would actually lead us forward. As Craig said, there are huge gaps in some of the hate crime legislation. We know currently it does not cover misogyny, although recent events means that some of that may well be rectified. We know that some of the levels of proof vary between some of the strands of hate crime, but at its heart, it has something that is valuable and I think can show us the way in terms of moving forward. We do, however, need incredibly strong, clear moral leadership. Part of the problem that occurred after the Brexit referendum was those ministers who had responsibility for hate crime at the time were utterly silent in condemning the increase in Islamophobia and racism that was inherent in that. We need to re-establish that there is no hierarchy of hate. I spent last summer absolutely frustrated in trying to persuade government ministers that they needed to condemn the attacks on Southeast Asian communities that were occurring, particularly attacks on Chinese nurses. However, when there was a pretty dreadful, but nevertheless a non-criminal tweet from the rapper Wiley that was anti-Semitic in nature, the volume of condemnation that came from government then was overwhelming. I think that is really unfortunate, because we're starting to establish a hierarchy of hatred, which is not saying that we're there for everyone. Policing needs to absolutely show it's there for everyone, and we need to address attacks on frontline staff, including police officers and others, as a priority. We need to encourage reporting, and we need to have those links. And this is where I think Craig is absolutely spot on. We need to have those links in with communities prior to the point at which those communities feel themselves under attack. And we also need individuals to be upstanders. And finally, whilst I am not on the forefront in that debate between extremism and hatred, I'm absolutely on the front line on that debate between what is hate speech and what is free speech. I think actually we can start to understand, using the work that is done on hate crime, to make a distinction between those things that are offensive and those things that cause absolute damage to communities and community cohesion. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for kind of bringing, I think, some more, I don't know the best word way to kind of word it, but like the strands of hate, that's how you refer to it, kind of the different types of hatred and how they fit into how we explore hate in society is a kind of a done very well. So thank you very much for that, to kind of illustrating how wide of a spectrum it is. And we've had a couple of questions come through for your presentation as well. So hopefully we can feed those into our discussion at the end. And now I'll pass our mic on to our last speaker. Aaliyah, thank you for being here with us, and we're looking forward to what you've got to contribute.
I remembered to unmute myself before I spoke. That's the first. So good evening. Thank you so much for having me here today. Yeah, can I just say that was amazing listening to both of you. That was so informative, and both of your perspectives, I think, just add so much. And I found myself nodding along to everything that you were both saying, because they really reflect my own experience working at the grassroots on countering extremism. So what I think I'll just tell you a bit what I do. So I am the founder and director of WeRise. So we're a community interest company based in Bristol. WeRise is a really long acronym. It actually stands for Women Empowered Against Racism, Injustice, Sexism and Extremism. So extremism is in there. From the get-go, we have been aiming, challenging extremism was one of the social ills that we wanted to help dispel. But it's really interesting because I find myself kind of thinking twice, and I have for many years, about using that word extremism, and it's become very loaded, very tainted, and especially when Craig, when you were talking about your experience and the way that the different strands of counter-terrorism, countering violent extremism, the role of the community coordinators, and you said we need to go beyond theory, right? This is how does it actually play out on the ground, and the kind of things you were saying, I was thinking that was my experience. And actually I was going to spend 10 minutes talking about something else, and now that I've heard both of you talk, I've decided that I'm going to kind of elaborate and kind of paint a bit of a picture, to bring to life some of the things that you've been talking about. So I'm kind of just gonna just riff here, just improvise, because actually what you've said was so interesting and I really want to talk about that. Otherwise I'll just end up repeating what you've both been talking about. So the first thing that I wanted to say is I have not engaged directly on a project with extremism ever since we started. And that was deliberate. It was because the work of counter-extremism requires a degree of trust. You need to be a trusted, established voice in the community. And when we started out, we were not that. Right? We didn't have a track record. People didn't know who we were. And the initial response was, who are these women talking about extremism? They must be funded by the Home Office. They must be here to enforce government prevent policy by stealth, by pretending to do women's empowerment work, right? Pretty much what Craig was talking about, those English classes, and how there's so much suspicion within the Muslim community, because even when you're not using the word terrorism and counter-terrorism, you're not talking about national security, the word extremism is associated with that. So I feel like the split, that what you said, you know, the great divorce that happened, didn't really happen in the minds of most people, right? So I'll just tell you my experience. When I was very, very new and had just set up WeRise, I was approached by a community coordinator directly who said, you must come to these funding meetings. It was the Building a Stronger Britain Together, BSBT, something like that, right? And I said, oh, well, isn't that... Oh, so I had no idea at that time that this was to do with Prevent. And when I got to the funding meetings where they tell you what this funding is all about, they said lots of Muslim organizations are applying for it, mosques are applying for it, it's got nothing to do with Prevent, nothing to do with Prevent. And I said, well, what is it then? What is it? And they said, it's countering extremism. And I thought, how is that different? And I think it was I, as a person who did not have an academic background, my academic background is in, well, actually, my PhD that I'm doing is on the securitization of women's empowerment in Afghanistan in the war on terror. So it's kind of like there's parallels there, right? How some work that the Muslim community is trying to do does get co-opted by the security agenda, and it can. And there is this, this perception that certain women, right, are really kind of good faces for counter-extremism work, or that they are the right type of Muslim, right, that can work with the government, and therefore they can kill two birds with one stone, right? We can do our community work and we can be helping counter-extremism at the same time. And from the beginning, I was just very against this. I said, no, this is not how we operate. And I had many meetings to say, you know, what is this about? Why, you know, you have to understand that people in the community are suspicious, and they do conflate counter-extremism with Prevent. And there was one example where this community coordinator said, we want to come and speak to your people, speak to your group. And on that particular day, I couldn't be there because I had a PhD deadline. And she came with her colleague from Prevent. And they gave a presentation to all these Muslim women in the community and said they work with me and that I work with them on Prevent. So they used my name, which wasn't even, we were a fledgling organization. I didn't have a standing in the community, and they tarnished us with the name of Prevent in front of the whole community. And to give you, you know, real example of what actually happened, I had people turning up at my doorstep in my house, accusing me of working with Prevent, with my children at home. Right. So it's not easy to do this work, right? As a Muslim woman, if you want to address extremism, the way you can, if you're not careful, you can get very easily manipulated and co-opted into the security agenda or the white, you know, the Home Office agenda that want to use us. It was not a pleasant experience. And since then, I have said I would not, on principle, work with Prevent or with countering extremism on that basis. So yeah, that kind of paints, you know, brings to life kind of one of the things that you were talking about, Craig, when you were saying about butting heads and you know, being at the coalface, like that is actually what it is like. Something else, yeah, that happened. I thought I mean, rather than something that happened, I'll say the way that the different strands, so we have hate crime and we have community cohesion and we have community, we have countering extremism, and they do all overlap. So when we go to our community cohesion steering groups, there are people from those different strands and we're all kind of sharing information. So you have the hate crime statistics, and then you have the report from Prevent, and then you have people like myself reporting on what's going on the ground. And it does feel like there is like everyone's kind of working in their silos, but that we know that ultimately this is all related, that there is overlap there, and it kind of seems a bit pointless to be talking about it so individually. So I think I agree that this definition of hateful extremism is not necessary. And I think it is just sort of creating confusion. And yeah, I think there needs to be some questioning as to like, what is the purpose of that? What was the intention behind it? Because I am confused. I don't understand. So one of the other points that came up was the victim perception that Mike was talking about, which I want to say again, you know, that's really important. And it is true because so we were actually the victim of, I'm bringing personal experiences into this because I feel like it adds flavor. And you guys have done all the statistics and the academic stuff, so I'm just bringing kind of real life into this now. So we actually had an arson attack at our house about 5 years ago, and the impact on not just our family but the whole community was really strong, and people were worried because there was a perception that it was a hate crime. And when the police did investigate it, and it was not a hate crime, it was just a local pyromaniac, you know, there was this massive sense of relief actually, because it was this feeling that, okay, I don't have to explain to my children that we were targeted because of the color of our skin or our faith, because that fear would hang over you forever. You would feel like a walking target. And I think that is really important to see it from the victim's perspective, that when things are carried out from the motivation of hate, it is much, much worse. The psychological impact that it has on you cannot be underestimated. Another point that I wanted to address, and just tell me when I've gone over my time, please, Iysha. Mike, you were talking about the hierarchy of hatred. And yeah, absolutely. I feel really strongly about this because, you know, as a feminist, we strongly believe that misogyny should absolutely be considered a hate crime. And when I have been speaking to our local police and crime commissioner, and, you know, this has come up in discussions, the argument that is made is that it's too difficult, it's too pervasive, and it will be too much of a challenge to take on. And obviously my response would be, well, if something is such a massive problem in society, surely all the more reason to deal with it, not the opposite, that it's just too big. It affects society on so many levels. It's such a big problem that where do we even start? We can't, right? We were not going to touch that. So I think that just shows the priorities there. And the reality is, for women, we live with that hate day in, day out. And I think that is something that is just not recognized enough. Misogyny is not seen as an extremist view. The internet is absolutely full of mostly, well, actually, no, I was going to say white males, but actually no, of across the board, who are deniers of gender inequality, or they are if you've heard the term red pill men who believe that feminism is an attack on all men, and that actually the world is flipped, it's the other way around, that women have got all the power and actually it's men who are oppressed, right? And actually, there are so many Reddit groups and underground groups and forums and Facebook groups absolutely full of angry, hateful men. And that is obviously, we know that the level of violence that there is towards women in society, it's not going anywhere. And women have to live with that fear constantly. And I could talk about that for a whole hour, but I just wanted to bring that into the discussion as well, that there shouldn't be a hierarchy of hate, and there needs to be a good reason for why is denial of racism seen as unacceptable and a clear indicator that somebody is racist if they deny racism. But if someone denies the need for feminism, right, it's seen as, well, that's just an opinion, right? So gender inequality is not seen as an urgent social problem in the same way that we recognize that racism is, or of course that extremism and violent extremism is. But for women who suffer from domestic violence, 2 women die every single week from at the hands of a male. So it is a huge problem. So I think I'll leave it there, because obviously we do want to have time for questions, but that was just my contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaliyah, for adding your personal experience, which I know can be difficult at times into discussions like this and spaces like this. So thank you very much. And sidetracking from the whole conversation, that the title of your PhD sounds exciting as well. So I hope that goes well. But thank you for, I think when you share your personal experiences, it brings a depth by having kind of a bottom-up perspective on the policies that are implemented and how on a society or community level it does impact people, and these people are real and they have their own lives and families and communities. So thank you. I mean, my kind of colleagues are just commenting on how you've raised points on tokenism, perhaps in policy work as well, which is important, I think, for the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you very much for everyone and the kind of presentations that they've had. I'm just going to have a look at the questions that have come through. One question, and this is quite a broad question, so I'll perhaps put it out there, and if anyone wants to pick up, they can go straight for it. Do the public need a distinction between hateful extremism and extremism at all? Is there a need? I think Craig kind of alluded to whether we needed it or not. This question was kind of raised a bit, but do we need a distinction?
I can wade in on that one if you want. So I go back to the Extremism Commission. Were given this task by the Home Office to define extremism, and then they came up with hateful extremism. So it's exceptionally difficult to justify or to kind of almost delineate between extremism and hateful extremism, because these are proposed definitions that people have come up with, but they've not been rigorously tested. They're not legal definitions. They are, they're very much framed as working definitions. So I would go further than do we need to delineate between hateful extremism and extremism to do we need extremism to enter our policy space? And I would argue no. I think we don't drive policies into all other kind of conceptual chaos that ensues when you talk about social interactions. We have policies, we have laws. They are, on the whole, as Mike said, I've been all over the world. They are world leading. When we look at our response to terrorism in this country and to hate crime, just the very fact that we are as good as we are at capturing data we are very much world leader when you go abroad and see other people's responses. I do think we are entering a bit of a muddled area around this. I think extremism is a bit of a red herring in many ways. I think we're disappearing a little bit down the rabbit hole there and trying to define this thing and conceptualize it, whereas actually what we should be doing is one of the central conclusions from this most recent report from the Commission is that yes, we've identified gaps in our existing legislation. Let's fill those gaps, but let's fill it within the policy areas that exist, as opposed to driving business through a new policy area that, I've written policies and I've written strategies for many years now. And you've always got to think about the man in the street test. If you take your strategy and give it to a random member of the public in the street and they can understand it, then you've done a good job, because you've taken a huge amount of complexity and you've explained it in a really clear way. The problem is with extremism strategy is it doesn't do that, and it just leads to a huge plethora of more questions. So I'd go further than the kind of parameters of the question in saying I don't think we need a definition of extremism to enter the policy space at all.
Can I add something? So I feel like this obsession with definitions is just exhausting, and we need to move beyond that and also allow people to make their own definitions, right? So the government's got its definition, which is incredibly unhelpful and vague, but that doesn't mean the word extremism itself cannot be useful in different contexts. So, for example, I use the word extremism and then I define what I mean by it. And for me, when I talk about extremism, I specifically mean religious fundamentalism. So when I speak about extremism, I'm from the perspective from a Muslim women's community organization where we are addressing extremism within our community. I don't muddy the waters, and we try and stick to religious fundamentalism. So we are speaking about Islam, and we are speaking about conservative and hardline interpretations of Islam, which are, bad for women and bad for peace and justice. So that's our definition of what we mean. So I don't think the word, I think people should be allowed to use it they are allowed to use it. It's just a word, right? And we can define it as and when it's useful to us. Yeah.
Mike, was there anything you wanted to perhaps add?
Yeah, maybe just coming at it from a slightly different angle, where I do think there is a need to make a distinction, and it may sound a real dilution around this, is that distinction between hate speech and free speech, which governments consistently have failed to understand and to take recognition of. It's really going to come into focus with the Online Harms White Paper. That talks about hate speech without seeking to define it. And unless you have an understanding about those things that cause harm to others and those things which cause offence to others, and actually as a society we need to understand the differences between that. And I think I use that Boris Johnson quote a lot. I don't think his intent was to cause harm, but actually the impact did cause harm, and at that point there should have been something done about it. But actually I do think we need as a society to have that debate about the distinction between free speech and hate speech, and where that lies when it is not covered by criminal justice legislation.
A question that I had was when I first saw the term hateful extremism as something that had been developed and there was a report published. I genuinely thought that the definition was formulated around the rise of right-wing extremism, and hateful extremism would be somewhat used in the concept of trying to kind of understand right-wing extremism and how perhaps try and expand the kind of understanding of terrorism in the UK as we've seen a rise in right-wing attacks over the past years. And especially, Brexit was kind of brought up. I thought that this was an attempt to understand the new, the changes on the kind of society level. But the kind of more I read, and I don't know if it's the nature of extremism policy in the UK always gets brought down to, and there's no denying that radical Islamists or fundamentalists, as it was put, have done attacks in the UK and across the world. And I don't know if it's the nature of extremism that it always just happens to boil down to Islam, because it's seen as the most violent expression and of extremism. But we've seen non-Muslim or right-wing attacks on both places of worship and MPs in this country. Is there a reason why the conversation or the thinking is around Islam more often? And I really enjoyed when listening to Mike talking about the different strands of extremism. We could be talking about misogyny, we could be talking about racism, other examples. It's just I don't really know how to coin the question either, but it was kind of a shock to me to see how the conversations in writing has something that I thought genuinely was to understand this new wave of perhaps extremism in the country. Did it shock you, or is it something you were expected? And I don't know if it's because I'm a Muslim myself. It's something that I was shocked when I read, because I was expecting something different and didn't come across it. So just wondering your thoughts in general.
Yeah, Iysha, I had the same reaction actually as you. I genuinely thought that it was going to be addressing right-wing radicalization, and it seems like that if they're going to do that, there obviously is a need to recognize that much more, but I'm not sure what the need for an entirely separate definition would be for that. Just to say, I did have that same reaction as you, but inevitably the government does have an agenda, that there is a sort of war rhetoric that is pervasive throughout this. There is this mentality of us and them, and unfortunately Muslims are the other. So we, as important as it is to obviously recognize that what I call like religious fundamentalism, there is also right-wing extremism. But yeah, it feels like we have racism and we have Islamic extremism, if you want to call it that. We have so many different words to describe kind of the same thing often. So yeah, quite confusing and frustrating.
Can I offer maybe a slightly different view, and this comes down from personal experience, and it could be a skewed personal experience. Working with a lot of Prevent people and others working in local councils, actually, I think there has been a lot of focus on far-right extremism, and that has been taken into account. But at government level, the handling of this, and I'll just use an example that has absolutely come into the fore again, which is after the publication of the definition of anti-Semitism, there was an all-party parliamentary group that got together and sought to define Islamophobia. I think that definition was flawed for all sorts of reasons, but the failure of the government some 3-4 years later to come up with an alternative definition of Islamophobia means that a community already feeling that it is subject to prejudicial views, we're not going to change that. And it's that really clumsy mishandling of it, whereas I think it sets up those people trying to do the work in local councils and on the ground almost to fail from the outset. So I'm not sure that is the intent, but it certainly is the net result of it.
So it's just a thought from me on that, I suppose from a Prevent perspective. I suppose I was a Prevent practitioner from 2010 onwards, and it was pretty clear that there was a pivot towards, obviously the counterterrorism infrastructure was very much born of 9/11, 7/7. The kind of obviously the thinking then and thinking now is that the greatest threat from a terrorism perspective does emanate from Islamist terrorism. That's the national threat assessment even today. What we saw from about 2008-9 onwards was street mobilizations of extreme right groups, and then you saw this need to then focus or to make sure that the strategy covered all forms of terrorism. That's when this term was used within 2011's Prevent strategy. This is not only about, it's not, when we talk about counterterrorism infrastructure, it's not only directed at Islamist forms of terrorism, it's all forms. So I'd go so far as to say there was a huge amount of work done with communities to reinforce that message by way of reassurance, also to Muslim communities who have, obviously there's a huge body of research into the securitization of the state's relationships with Muslim groups through the lens of counterterrorism during that period. That can't be denied. And there was this real need to show that there was parity of response from a government perspective when we deal with all forms of terrorism. So I'd say even recently, it'd be very interesting to see how the response pivots towards other forms of terrorism that we've not discussed. So emanating from the far left. When we look at environmentalist groups as well, and this big furore a couple of years back now, when it was an Extinction Rebellion logo appeared on an awareness raising package that was delivered by Prevent practitioners, and this conceptualization of these groups as potentially raising terrorist threats as well, so or posing some kind of terrorist threat. So I think there's an optics element to this from a government and practitioner's perspective to reassure communities that we're serious across all forms of terrorism. But then there's also, playing in the background, we've got to make sure that our responses are threat and risk based. So we've got to put our assets into where the threats are emanating from at the time. So sometimes there's a very difficult balancing act to strike there.
Thank you. I mean, I was going to say, also with my kind of experience working with local councils or kind of being involved in their own discussions, I do see that there is that kind of awareness and nuance as well. But perhaps, as Mike mentioned, when it gets carried up to the government level, it becomes more about just policies and what's going on on the ground, and more about an image as well, and trying to create that in society. And I really liked how you touched upon Extinction Rebellion as well, because that's, I think, one of the last panels that we're going to be having in this series as well. So I'm looking forward to discussing climate and extremism as well. I know we're just over time, but we have one final question. And if I could ask that question, and then hopefully we can wrap up the discussion. What roles do you think tech companies play in countering this imminent threat that severely undermines our social cohesion? And I've had some other questions about, the role of the online world. Is it just the government, or do these companies, shall they have some role in policy as well? So just your general thoughts on that.
I'm happy to absolutely. I mean, a lot of our work is now focused on online hatred and removing online hatred where it exists, and seeking. I ran a project some time ago, developing volunteers that were delivering counter-narrative. I think part of the problem is our focus, and certainly government's focus, has been more or less exclusively on Facebook, Twitter, and the very platforms that most young people don't use, and actually, in terms of a lot of this work, are pretty irrelevant. I remember working with a group of young people who said, if you want to get really visceral, nasty misogyny and racism, go and play Call of Duty or FIFA online for a time, which is a whole area that is just simply ignored in terms of some of this work. I think we need to take sensible steps forward. But the other side of it, I would also say, I'm not seeking to defend tech companies, but also if we are setting standards for tech companies, those same standards should also apply to other forms of media, including the print media. We currently are in the ridiculous situation where I can get articles printed in the Daily Mail removed from Twitter for their hate content. That frankly cannot be right, and that cannot be sensible in terms of going forward.
I don't mind jumping in here as well. So one of the current projects that we're doing at the moment is in schools, and it is on digital citizenship and media literacy for young people to help specifically reduce hate and intolerance, and to promote community cohesion. But we discuss, we discuss whose responsibility is this? Is this the social media companies? And again, yeah, it is not about Facebook and Twitter. Apparently, if you use Facebook, you're old, according to the students I teach. All right, well, I got told there. But it's also about engaging with young people, and we need to do a lot more outreach and education with them to really prepare them and arm them with the tools and the critical thinking skills that they need, and for them to understand how algorithms work and how filter bubbles work and how you end up in echo chambers, and how young people can end up being surrounded completely by people who think the same as them, and how the internet is actually designed to take you down a funnel that gets narrower and narrower and narrower, right? So that literally more extreme. That is how algorithms actually work. So I think that definitely needs some more research and looking at, and there needs to be a lot more awareness about it. And that is part of the work that we're doing at school, is teaching young people that this is how you end up with a polarized society. And, going back to the fact that this is the dialogue society, we have to give, as adults, we need to learn as well. And then we need to teach young people as well how to speak to each other, how to challenge each other respectfully, how to listen to people who don't have the same opinions as us, to, how to get away from this cancel culture that we have, right? That if you don't agree with me, you're just evil and bad, right? Okay, and you are everything that is wrong with society. We are, of course, we know that we are becoming more polarized, and I think that social media absolutely does have a big part to play in us getting to this point.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you both. I think in all of my work in the online space, it all comes down to one thing, and that's relevance. So these social media companies are entirely built upon the in ensuring that the services, the adverts, the searches that you conduct, the results that you get are relevant to you. So that's an entire business model that ensures that if you type in red trainers into Google, you will get the most relevant searches. Who pays for the most for their ads, etc. You will get to that website and you'll buy your red trainers from a company. And the same thing happens with stream content. If you want something, you'll find it, and you'll get the most relevant search results. And that's why I remember one of the quotes coming from the Dylann Roof trial in the States was, he said, I Googled white genocide and I went down that rabbit hole and never came back. And that's the problem with this stuff, because there's no moderation of it. So the irrelevance trumps all. And until we can, I suppose, inject some social responsibility into what are multinationals, and we've seen how governments across the world have find this exceptionally challenging, because the definition of hate crime in one country is completely different to the next. So what rules do they apply? So it's something that governments are going to have to grapple with for some time, in injecting, as I say, corporate social responsibility into these tech platforms. But they absolutely, my view is they're not doing nearly enough to take responsibility for what's going on in their digital backyards. Back to my policing days, if there was a local pub where there was drug dealing going on, absolutely the pub landlord would be held accountable for what they're allowing to take place on their premises. The digital space is exactly the same. It's they are responsible for what they allow to take place, and value judgments can be drawn upon their responses to various social phenomena. So, be it counterterrorism, child sex exploitation, human trafficking. If these things are going on their platforms, they have a role in I suppose shaping the debate around what the response should be.
Thank you very much for both talking about the role of responsibility, and also, we're 10 minutes over, but just to what Aaliyah said, that we can sometimes be in our own social bubbles when it comes to social media as well. That's something that I kind of witnessed. I was as part of a interfaith group visiting a synagogue. And then I realized how, many perhaps biases, or I was worried that they'd be fearful of me, and that they were worried that I'd be fearful of them, and that we'd been in our social bubble so much and hadn't had the opportunity to get to know one another outside the debates of the politics of the Middle East, that we didn't realize how much we had in common. And that kind of very simple interaction for me, which a lot of people who look at interfaith work from the outside can see it as flowers and everyone's smiling for a few hours. But really it's extremely, and I'll use the term radical in a nice sense here, radical and transformative for a lot of people who have those encounters for the first time. And it really can make a difference in how you perceive things. And then you can take that back into your own community as first-hand experience. So for a lot of my friends who see some of my work as just flowers, I kind of assure them that it's very, very kind of radical and nice sense work, just as today's discussion was. So thank you very much for all three of you for your contributions, both in the panel section and also in the Q&A section as well. Thank you for dedicating some time in your evening to us, and I hope to have further discussions on these topics as time comes on. So enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me. All the best.
Bye.
Bye.